Welcome to this new edition of the EuropeChat series. Today, we're going to look at one of the major files which faces the EU decision makers nowadays. It's about the next Multiannual Financial Framework for the years 2028-2034. This is an important moment because you talk about the financing of all of our policies. The Commission got the ball rolling in July with a proposal, which will now trigger a long negotiation process. I would like to briefly point out what this package contains. There are three elements in it. The first one is an own resources decision, which is about how we get the finances. This is governed by unanimity between the member states and national ratification. Secondly, we have an MFF regulation, which decides about how the funds are being spent in the various rubrics over the years. This is a regulation which requires unanimity in the Council and the assent of the Parliament. And then, in order to dish out the money, you do need legal bases. And those legal bases, a number of texts, a few dozen texts, which are negotiated by the ordinary legislative procedure, co-decision between the Council and the Parliament. In order to discuss all of this, I have invited a very prominent expert of European affairs, Klaus Welle. Hello, Klaus. Klaus is retired, like I personally am, but he's very active. He does a lot of things. He works at the Martens, but he has many other roles. But for me, the most important part is what he did as a Secretary-General in the Parliament over many years, Parliament being an important institution, and Klaus was its Secretary-General. The interesting thing about Klaus is that he never forgot to look at the EU as a whole, because he understood that nothing works in the EU without a strong cooperation between the institutions and with the member states. So, Klaus, thanks very much for having accepted to talk to us today. And my first question is, why is the MFF so important for the EU? And how do you see the European Parliament's role in this?
Yeah, thank you very much, Jim, also for this very kind welcome. The MFF is very important because it gives reliability, both on the income side and on the spending side, and this for a period of 7 years. This is completely unknown in a national context. For the European Parliament, this is a bit of a mixed bag because, yes, the European Parliament is in many ways a co-decision maker in this, but also it ties its hand for 7 years. And no national parliament would ever do this. So the position in the negotiation of the Parliament, from my point of view, is structurally rather weak for the following reason. A, if you don't come to an agreement, then you fall back to the old figures. And the old figures are never very attractive because they represent the old problems and the old amounts. So that's not an attractive option for Parliament. So in negotiation, there's a term called BATNA, best alternative to negotiated agreement. And that BATNA is always very bad for Parliament. So that doesn't give it a strong hand. And secondly, as you have said, on the Council side, you needed unanimity. And that unanimity is very difficult to come by. So once there's unanimity, the space for Parliament is limited, and therefore Parliament is well advised to rather come in early in the debate as it is trying right now.
Yeah, that's an important point you're making. And the unanimity is, there's even a different aspect to this, because the unanimity is reached normally at the European Council, the heads of state and government, to negotiate this. And it makes it even more difficult to sort of divert from it. And this brings me to saying a word about the history of the MFF. The MFF was not created by the treaties, as we know. It was the leaders collectively in the 80s who decided that they needed more long-term planning, as you've been saying. And that's how they set up. And the first MFF was the Law Package 1 in 1988. Do you remember a bit about this? And do you remember what the position in the parliament was? Of course, you were much younger, but do you vaguely remember something about this period?
Um, Look, I was still at university, so I was a little bit detached. But of course, this was the time when the budget was increasing quite heavily. The law was ambitious, was the time of the internal market. And of course, the internal market needed to be flanked by other measures, which made it acceptable for everybody to open up those markets. So at the time, I think this was a fair deal because figures were rising. But at the same time, Parliament promised some reliability, some clarity for the future. So I think we have to see these two things together. A strongly rising budget plus a promise of reliability and agreement by the Parliament, which was the historical situation at the time, but it's no longer the situation we are in today.
Right. Yes, I maybe for the auditors, I'll just quickly summarize the historic development. So we had the Delors One package, which was very much geared also towards achieving the single market. Then we had the Delors Two package 5 years later. At the time, it was 5 years. Then we switched to 7, and that was of course linked to EMU and the arrival of the thing. Then we had a third package, which was not called Package Delors or Package Someone, was called Agenda 2000. And for a reason which maybe I should explain, I was Jacques Santos' chef de cabinet, and when I came and said to him, we have to prepare the center package, he said, Jim, find another way, another name. I'm just the president of the commission. It shouldn't be a center package. So we invented Agenda 2000, which was very much linked to the incoming enlargement. Then we had a few other packages until the last one, which was negotiated in 2020, and which was, of course, characterized by a big innovation that on top of the MFF spending, we created a resilience and recovery fund of 750 billion for the first 4 years of the period. So we've come a long way. What is your assessment of this? What strikes me? What has changed? What were the major evolutions in your view over the years?
I mean, you have explained this very well. When you want to create a market, it's not coming automatically. Other countries which maybe feel they are a bit weaker in competition, in economic competition, they need to be able to catch up. And therefore, it was logical to create additional financial means to do that. Or if we think about Spain and Portugal, for example, at the time, for them it was very important to have additional means in the budget to catch up. But that's not our situation anymore, but we have the same instruments. So I think from the point of view of Parliament, and I've said it already, to give the executive a guarantee for the basic outline of the budget for 7 years is something no national parliament would ever consider. You have annual budgets. I don't know any national system which works with such a long kind of planning. So my view is that it has become a kind of straitjacket. What was reasonable at the time, in times of growing budgets, is now for Parliament becoming more and more a straitjacket. And this also for another reason. Parliament is now negotiating at the beginning of the legislature on the content.
Yes.
And let's say I played a little bit of role in this development. So the priorities change. If we compare this parliament, for example, to the last parliament was all about the Green Deal, the last legislature. Now, number one is competitiveness. Number two is security. Very different set of priorities. But you're fixed in a planning for 7 years. So it doesn't make sense to develop political priorities that then cannot be immediately underpinned by the necessary financial means. So therefore, I would argue the minimum that would need to be changed is to go to a 5 years multi-annual financial framework that's linked to the period of the legislature and the commission in office. Still not easy because it takes, I would say, 1.5 years probably to in preparations, even if that could be condensed a little bit. But we have to see better that the financial means are in line with the political priorities agreed between the Parliament, the Commission, which for me is the executive, and of course the Council, which has given a very similar input, by the way. So this falling apart is something which is, from my point of view, very, very negative.
But one of the other answers to the rigidities which are in a long-term planning is, of course, flexibility within the budget. And there, I think we'll come back to this, there are certain things which allow to have more flexibility. But before getting there, maybe I'll say a word about the process now. So there's a proposal by the Commission. Now both the Parliament and the Council are eagerly studying this. You see a lot of reflection of this already in the media. The fact of the matter is, we are not really yet in a negotiating stage. We are at a positioning stage. I always try to explain this to people. Things will heat up now over time. I think the intention of the President of the European Council is to conclude this before the end of next year at the level of the European Council, which of course is not the end of it, because afterwards we have a negotiation with Parliament. Parliament has to give its assent, etc. So it's a long process. About this timeline, how do you see this? Are you optimistic that this will work, or do you see big barriers?
I don't think that it will work, because it has never worked, in my
Right.
experience.
Never in the first go.
No, on the Council side, it's always difficult to come to any kind of agreement. I wouldn't go so far to say maybe it's strategy, but Council has a tendency to run down the clock, and then to put a lot of pressure on Parliament to agree immediately and to not have a decent conversation about those priorities. I've been in this process already. I remember during Martin Schulz's presidency, we were also in an MFF negotiation, and Council was always too late, like it is always too late, which is structure for its reasons. And once the European Council had an agreement, they were absolutely desperate that the Parliament would agree immediately. And Martin Schulz sent me in and said, look, try to get something. And I got out a couple of billions additionally for youth exchanges.
More flexibility.
Yeah, flexibility is really the problem, because flexibility has always been a key demand for Parliament. And normally, flexibility as we understand it in that dimension has been dried out during the Council negotiations, has been taken out, because member states don't want flexibility. They want guarantees for their national so-called envelope, what they think is their national envelope. They don't want any kind of surprises. So our experience is that the flexibility is asked for by Parliament, but normally was not accepted by the Council. And that's one of the other major problems. If you have a 7 years planning and don't have decent flexibility, surprise is always going to come. You have COVID, you have a Ukraine war, and then if all the amounts are fixed, how can you react to these necessities? So we have a double problem. This structure doesn't allow us to adapt to the new political priorities of the legislature, because it's not aligned to the 5-year cycle. And secondly, it's very difficult then to react in crisis situations. We did react in fairness. We found the monies for Ukraine.
Yes.
We also found money for COVID, but it makes it a very, very difficult exercise.
The EU is quite inventive when it has to be very, as you and I know. So I've always been amazed at this. And of course, what happened in 2020 was, of course, I think, a major development. Because we had the MFF and we added 750 billion, so that we got to about 1.26% of GNI overall. And when the Commission made its proposal now, which is close to 2 trillion euros over the 7 years, looked a lot of money. But actually, if you compare it to the MFF plus the next generation funds of 750 billion, the increase is not enormous. What do you think about that? My hunch is that tactically the Commission was probably right to be careful, because if it proposes too much, you'll immediately get a negative reaction in the Council. What is your take on this?
Yeah, on the amounts, Parliament always believes that the amounts are too too little, and the member states believe always it's exaggerated. So there's a kind of typical exchange on this. It's depending, in fact, on what we want to do with the money. And I think there would be good arguments to say that European public goods should be financed from the common budget. If we were to do that, we would rather be speaking about 5% than 1%, and of course less expenditure on the national state. But that would involve issues like border protection, for example. That would involve much more defense, because these are common goods. And if I think, for example, about border protection, I think about my own country, Germany. We don't have an external border of the Union anymore on land. Yes, airports, but on land, which means that basically the Greeks, the Italians, and the Spanish are paying the German border protection, and that can't be right. So it would be more correct to finance border protection from a common European Union budget. We are not there because we don't have sufficient agreement yet on the rules and how it should be applied, and it's an important aspect of national sovereignty. But in principle, border protection, and I would also argue defense, dependent on how dynamically this develops, should come from the European Union budget, and then we would need to speak of a budget rather like 5% than the current.
Yeah, which is impossible in my view in the short term. But you're right. But to be fair, I think, for instance, both on migration defense, the sums are going up over years. But of course, I think they should go up more. The question is, of course, if you stay within a relatively limited budget, as the member countries prefer, then it's a question of balancing. And then you run into the problem that there are the traditional policies, common agricultural policy, structural funds, which member countries also want to preserve, and so it's a difficult balance overall. And in terms of the expenditure structure, the Commission has been quite innovative now. They have proposed to reduce. There are a lot of programs right now, a bit scattered all over the place, and they want to have three major funding approaches. And the first one is very controversial, both with the Parliament and within the Council. It is on agriculture, to have a decentralized program for agriculture and cohesion for each member country, with flexibility for the member country to dish it out. And that looks very controversial. And next to that, we have a competitiveness fund, and then we have the external fund for all kinds of things. It seems to me that it is an interesting proposal, but it will require a lot of negotiations. And some people fear that if you give too much margin of maneuver to the member states, you don't have control from here. Within the member states, for instance, in a country like Spain, they are worried, or some people are worried, that the regions would lose out because you would lose the direct contact between the regions. And so what do you think about all of this? It's a complicated issue.
Yeah, that's a lot of questions together. So the first is, in fact, in the past, we have seen that with limited budgets, there's always the danger that old priorities crowd out the new priorities. On the other hand, we also should give sufficient respect for agricultural spending. Because we should not forget that this common agriculture policy has allowed us, to be self-sufficient in agriculture, which nowadays seems normal, but we are struggling now on raw materials because we don't want to be dependent. So at least we should be happy that we are not dependent on agriculture, and with good quality and with good environmental standards. I mean, when you travel in the United States, you can easily see the difference, not only on the environmental standards, but also on the price level. And if we think about this populist wave that's rolling over Europe, we don't want to give it another boost. So I would strongly defend that this agriculture spending, even though it's very traditional, it hasn't lost anything of its relevance. I just saw a figure in Germany. The people with the weaker income, they pay half of their income for their housing already. So any penny counts, or any euro counts. So especially expenditure for food has to remain affordable. And I think there is a success story here for the European Union, which we should not neglect. So when I say old expenditure, I'm not saying that this expenditure is outdated. But we also need to be able now, for example, to finance defense. The Commission has proposed altogether 131 billion on defense, according to their own accounting. I hope it's right, which is absolutely necessary. And what is, I think, very useful already is that we open up other expenditure current categories for defense spending. Let's take research. I mean, why shouldn't we finance research on defense? Why shouldn't we accompany upstarts in the defense sector? Why should we stabilize just the old defense companies? Why should we force our defense upstarts, if they want to grow, to have to go to America or to have to sell them to America? That doesn't make any sense. So I think that's very necessary. Equally, military mobility. We have now opened up for cohesion funds to also be used for military mobility, which makes a lot of sense because when you build a road, when you build a railway network, when you build a harbor, you can equally consider that it's good enough to help our friends in the Baltics or in Poland or in Romania if they should be aggressed.
Yes.
So, this approach which we had, that defense is something dirty and it's somehow close to smoking or drug abuse. I mean, that was ridiculous in the first place, and fortunately this is now changed. So that means that some of the amounts which in the past were there have now dual use, and that gives us maybe some additional fiscal space without having to increase the amounts as well. But it's a tight budget.
Yeah. No, I think there are many things in what you said. I mean, one important message I take from it, you started by saying public goods. And basically what you say, and I do agree with that point, is agriculture is also a public good. So it's not old versus new. It's simply to, the second thing, maybe which I wanted to point out is, of course, public goods, there are different types of them. Now, in the case of agriculture, the reason it takes such a big part of the spending in the EU budget is because it is an exclusive competence of the EU. Whereas for historic reasons, defense is not at all. So in defense, while the budget must increase and there must be more of an EU effort, obviously, by far the biggest part of the spending will remain national. But that brings me to another question, and that is about the own resources. Because in reality, and this was the interesting bit about what happened in 2020, where we had the MFF, the budget proper, and we had the new structures where we would ask the Commission to go to the financial markets to raise the money and to send it on as gifts or loans to the member states. So a completely new approach. What do you think about that? Will we need this in the future too?
I think it was necessary at that moment in time because you cannot run a single currency area just with monetary policy. You need fiscal tools on the federal level of the system and to manage crisis situations as a stabilizer, not automatic stabilizer, unautomatic stabilizers, but as a stabilizer. So it was necessary, but that doesn't mean that the way it was done should be repeated, because it had very important shortcomings.
Okay, tell me.
Lack of parliamentary control on the European Union level. I heard representatives of the Court of Auditors who say, we cannot judge any of those expenditures, how it was spent, because there were very loose aims for the spending and they can't be controlled. So that means we don't know how that money was exactly spent, whether it was spent properly. And both the budgetary control process in Parliament and in the Court of Auditors has effectively been sidelined. So I think if we want to have a fiscal tool on the European Union level, we need to correct those. We need proper participation of Parliament, and we need to be able to have proper control by the European Court of Auditors. Otherwise, we are more in the area of budget support, which sometimes we have with third countries, which was necessary in that situation. I'm not criticizing it for a second. It was very important, especially for the countries in the south, which were most affected at the very beginning. But to draw from this the consequence that this should be the way we function in the future, I think is wrong.
So, Klaus, if I understand you correctly, I mean, I understand your point in a way. I would distinguish between the desirability of doing joint borrowing for the future is one thing. The way we do it is a different one. I'm in favor of it, but I do take your point that we should have a look at, has it delivered? We should maybe have a very independent evaluation on how the money was spent. What was the effectiveness of the money? Because sometimes we have a sort of accountant's approach only, which you need, but it's not enough. You must need what has happened in Italy or in Belgium or with the money spent. Would you agree with that?
I fully agree with this, and this was the problem. These were relatively lofty goals, but in reality, the real goal was to stabilize the financial situation in a times of standstill, because COVID caused a kind of economic standstill. I agree that when you want a single currency, and we have a single currency, you also need fiscal tools. You cannot only manage it with monetary tools, or if you want to manage it just with monetary tools, then you push the European Central Bank in a role it doesn't feel comfortable in. And probably the member states don't feel comfortable with the European Central Bank in that role. So we need fiscal tools, but these two flaws which I mentioned, they need to be corrected. We need to have proper parliamentary control on the European level, because the 27 cannot objectively, and we need to have proper budgetary controls through the Court of Auditors. These would be my two caveats, and I believe, of course, it should be used for something which is, in fact, a common good. And I would see here mainly defense. We had a discussion, for example, about kind of Iron Dome, air protection for the European Union. We see in Ukraine how important this is. And not just for the eastern states, by the way. We see drones now flying more or less everywhere. So I think that could be a project which could be financed jointly. So it needs to make sense. It needs to be properly scrutinized by the Parliament and the Court of Auditors. But a common fiscal capacity in a currency union is absolutely necessary.
Oh, thanks very much. I want to briefly come back to the own resources as such. I mean, we have traditional own resources, the VAT resource, the GNI resource, which is based on the relative wealths of our countries. We have a plastics tax. So the Commission has proposed a few new own resources taxes. If I have to look at the list of them, they propose to use more of the revenues of the emission trading system, the ETS. They want to use the carbon border adjustment mechanism to have more money. They want to have an electronic waste levy. They want to put taxes on aviation and even on high incomes. So what is your take on that? I suppose the Parliament would be favorable to all of them, or not?
Look, the European Parliament, the European Union, from its foundation, financing was based on own resources. Sometimes forget this. This was at the very beginning. Sometimes now people discuss as if this is a revolutionary idea. But these were customs and tariffs. And then we reduced customs and we reduced tariffs, and they fell by the wayside. And then we had to introduce, GNI factors, value-added tax, and so on. And then the member states suddenly had the impression, okay, this is like a kind of country club where you have to pay a membership fee. But legally, it's wrong. We are based on own resources from the very beginning. So what is necessary now is to reestablish what was there from the very beginning. And then the question is, how do we do this? Maybe we will also have more tariffs again. Donald Trump is giving the example.
The way we are going, yes.
For a world where tariffs play a more important role and customs and tariffs. But we need own resources. I'm not selective now on the proposal list of the Commission because, again, we made the experience from last time. Parliament had a very detailed negotiation with the Council as a part of the overall agreement on which own resources should be created and when. And they all had dates associated with this, and not a single one was done. So I welcome that the Commission is not giving up hope and making another effort. And I think it's absolutely needed. But Council, when it came to it, disagreed between the member states. The one could accept this one, the other ones could accept that one, and the outcome was zero. So I hope for the best, but I'm not very optimistic.
Yeah, Klaus, if I understand you correctly, you would love to have, for the EU, to have a Hamiltonian moment after Hamilton, the federal secretary at the beginning of the American Republic, who started creating an American financing system. But your feeling is still a lot of work to be done on this. Would you agree with that?
Yeah, sometimes we forget how long the integration process took in the United States and how tedious it was. And in 1913, the United States still had a federal budget of 1%.
Very,
where we are.
Very interesting point.
Which is where we are, 1%. And they were basically financed by tariffs, which is where we should be legally in principle. And then it was changed because they had too much income, strangely enough, and they introduced federal income tax. And that shifted the thing. So 1913 compared to the founding moment is nearly 150 years in. We are 80 years in, something like this. So I think the moment will come. I don't think this MFF is the moment, but I think the moment will come. I'm a strong believer that integration always has to happen based on necessity and not on ideology. Ideology drives us against the wall, but necessity drives integration, and then everybody can agree to this. That's how we now suddenly are able to discuss defense after we've forgotten about it since the 1950s, because necessity is driving us there. And necessity one day will also drive us to a more solid financing of the Union and a budget which is covering European public goods.
Klaus, this is a brilliant conclusion and a very encouraging one, because you place things in the longer term perspective. And I think that's what we should be doing with you. And I loved your references to what happened in the United States. So this concludes our Europe chat today. I hope you found it interesting. I hope you were convinced that it's worth looking things up, getting more knowledge about what is such a fundamental process. I would like in this context to refer to recent TEPSA experts European Council debrief, where we asked a dozen of experts from our network to write pieces about the MFF. So I would very much like you to watch this EuropeChat, but also to go and do some more reading and to follow the negotiations, which will be tough and which will last over the next 2 years. Thank you very much. Stay tuned in and see you at our next EuropeChat.